Okay, so now that we've seen how to turn solid objects into 3D soft bodies, let's look at a particular thing that it's just nice to have, is how to pump something up. And of course, what we use for this is the pressure constraint. So I have this toy here and I positioned it a little bit already. So let's start with a pressure. And of course, what we can't find is a pressure setup. So we remember it's called Vellum configure balloon for some reason. And if we put this together, it's important to remember that it creates two constraints. One for the membrane, so for the surface, which is the cloth constraint. And then for the interior volume is the second constraint called pressure. There it is. So let's connect this to our Vellum solver. And I can use the cool J button to connect them easily. And once I run this with the default settings, we can see it falls down and it gets a little bit, it falls through the not existing ground. Let's fix this first. There you go, ground position. And now it falls down. And as you can see, not at first, but then pretty quickly you can see there is some kind of volume in my object that tries to stay persistent. So let's make sure that the whole pressure thing is a bit higher. And as we know, this is just the rest length. So let's increase the rest length, let's say to 2. So until we find something that looks fun. And you can see right in the beginning, it kind of pushes it outwards. Oh, let's take it real time. There you go. It pushes it outwards and then it falls down. But the problem with this is, of course, is that it still sets an initial pressure, an initial volume. It does not actually increases. So how can we do this? The instinct would be to set the rest length not to a static object, a static number in the beginning, but to animate this. So let's try this. We animate from 1 in the first frame by just clicking Alt on the parameter. And then I go to, let's say, frame 24. And I set the number to something high, like 10, and press Alt again on it. And now, because it's green and we can see it down here, there's a keyframe on it. Let's see what happens. And you can see nothing happens because nothing changes. And the reason for that is that the constraint settings on the Vellum constraint node are only setting the initial state. So it only sets the start condition, but it does not change anything during our simulation. So as we know, what we have to do is we have to go into our simulation, into the dive target, and here we can change the properties. And as we know, what we use for this is the Vellum constraint property. And here we can change the attribute. And the attribute we want to change is either the rest length directly or the rest length scale, which just means that the rest length scale is a multiplier of the rest scale that goes in. So this is usually the better approach because it's just a multiplier for whatever you set in the beginning, or you take an absolute number in the rest length. So let's do that and let's see what happens when we animate this from the first frame to the frame 24. And let's go aggressive and set it to 10 again. And let's see what we get. And when we run this, you can see something is happening, but the whole toy is growing in a weird way, which is not what we want. Now, of course, what just happened is we did not actually specify what constraint we want to change the rest length for. We only animated the rest length. So the good news is it works, but it's it applies to everything, including the cloth. So what just happened is that the membrane, the cloth surface, was also growing, not just the volume inside. And this is why it looked so weird. So what we have to do is we have to limit this to a particular constraint, which is our pressure constraint. So let's see if we can find it. And we can't. There's only bend and stretch. And the reason is that there is no group for our pressure constraint assigned in this node. But that's easy to do because we just have to turn on the output group here, because the pressure stretch, which is a bit weird, is actually the volume. They just reused the same naming. So let's make sure that we're not getting confused with the stretch constraint or the stretch stiffness from the cloth by just calling the whole thing pressure. There you go. And now what we should find here in our group is the pressure group where our constraints are in. Let's see if that worked. Oh yeah, that's much better. Let's look at it from the outside. You because it's more fun. And there's our toy, and the poor guy is pumped up quite a bit over time. So great, so we can do it this way. We could stop the video here, but let's talk a bit more about this, because I want to show you a couple more things about the dynamic constraints. We could have done it differently. And all we need to do is change the rest length. And this is important to remember. So we don't even need to use the output group, because as long as we know what we want, we could do it manually. Because what we can look for is in the constraints that come out of this here, are different constraint types. So we have the distance constraint from the cloth. Then if we go further down, we have also the bend constraint from the cloth. And somewhere further down, there are a couple of pressure constraints. So interestingly enough, even without giving it a group, there are, of course, curves in this big mass here, and I think it's those here, that have a certain type of constraint on it called pressure. So we could have used that instead. And there are multiple ways of doing this. For example, in the Vellum constraint property, we could have said, okay, what was it that was called pressure? It was called type. So the attribute that we're looking for is type. So we could have said, give us kind of a dynamic group, and let me quickly show you that the pressure group isn't existing anymore. We just turned it off. So we could say, give me, change only the rest length scale for everything that has a type of pressure. And you write it like this. Let's double check if that actually works. And as you can see, it works. So this is also possible. So whenever you use dynamic, you want to change constraints dynamically, you don't always have to rely on the groups alone. So there are other ways even. And instead of using the Vellum constraint property, you could have also used the geometry wrangle. So the geometry wrangle right here allows you to basically change any geometry in your simulation. And all you have to make sure here is that we're not actually changing the geometry, which would be the surface of our geometry and not the constraints of it, but we change the constraint geometry. So let's make sure that under data bindings, we change it to constraint geometry. Make sure that you spell it right. And now we can basically use this like a Vellum constraint property. So for example, first of all, make sure that you change the run over from points to primitives. Very important, because we want to change the rest length on the primitives, not on the points of the constraint. Otherwise it doesn't work. And then you can use the group, for example, the way we used it before, with only change where the type is pressure. And to show this, let's just for now change the rest length to 10 right away. And boop, as you can see, it instantly grows to something a bit extreme. So maybe that was a bit mean. Let's change the rest length to 2. Yeah, and there you can see what it does. By the way, it behaves like this because every single element of my geometry is one object. Remember, the toy has this kind of weird setup that it's built of multiple objects. Maybe we could quickly change this. Of course, we know that we can use our VDB trick for this. So VDB from polygons, and then a convert VDB to turn it to polygons. And let's make sure we find a good resolution. Oh, that's a bit too much. Yeah, maybe like this. And now the whole thing is one object, and our deformation will be a bit more logical. There you go. It's more like one big thing. So that works. Now, what you've noticed though is we just switched it to a higher number, not actually growing. And the way you do that is you just multiply this with a number every frame. So if you wanted to grow by 10% every frame, you just multiply it by 1.01, which means, sorry, not 10%, this would be 1%, of course. So now it will grow by 1% every frame, and that's just another way of doing this. You can see it's a bit more complicated, but I think it helps to understand what's actually going on. And you can see if we wait a bit, well, let's make it faster actually, let's make it grow by 5% every frame. But I think it's worth at this point, because we're at the end of the Vellum course, to understand, our possibilities a bit better. You can totally go with the Vellum constraint property, but kind of understanding that all of this is just attributes on our constraint geometry shows you that you can do some really crazy stuff like this. Okay, so just quickly before we finish this, the question might be, what can I do to bring back my geometry? And you should probably know the answer to this. Now we used a simplified version, let's call it, of this for our simulation to apply the deformation back to our original geometry for rendering. As usual, we can use a point deform. So what we have here is what we want to deform, which is our original, then the rest position, which is the same just as a simplified version, and then the deformed version of this is coming from our simulation, and then the whole thing, you can see now, will work with our original geometry, and the same change will be applied to our original geometry. Okay, so multiple ways of doing this, as you can see. Hopefully that made sense. Again, we can just switch it back to the normal Vellum constraint property, which is the easier way of doing this, but you don't have to use it. All it does is it changes attributes on our constraint geometry. That's really all it is. And the other option looks like this. So both a lot of fun. Pumping up anything is always funny. If you want a lot of clicks on Instagram, then take, for example, a human 3D scan or something with this. This is always, people find this pretty fascinating. So have a lot of fun with pumping stuff up, and I hope this was helpful. Thank you very much, and see you later. Cheers.